Hello, I'm Sophia, and this is The World Unpacked. Going into 2024, we were all wondering, including on this podcast, what this super election year, with elections taking place all around the globe, was going to bring. And as the year has progressed, a number of different theories have developed, all of which try to come up with a more or less sweeping explanation for what we have seen. There's the bonfire of incumbents theory, which sees a trend of ruling parties having been booted out. There are those who see a global right-wing movement emerge. And as the year comes to a close, we're seeing more and more sort of definitive analysis on what the year tells us about the state of democracy, though they don't seem to agree if the news is good or bad necessarily. And so for our final episode of the year, I really wanted to bring on Tom Carothers, director of Carnegie's Democracy, Conflict and Governance program, and a leading expert on democracy and international politics, to help us sort through the various narratives out there right now and discuss what we know and what we don't know as this year of elections draws to a close. Tom, welcome to the show.
Nice to be with you.
Tom, I want to start by asking you to explain the bonfire of incumbents theory, this view that's taken hold that 2024 has been a particularly terrible year for candidates running for re-election or for candidates endorsed by outgoing leaders. What's the thinking here? Why do people think that incumbents had it particularly hard this year, and then was it really that dramatic?
This idea that 2024 is, as one commentator colorfully put it, the bonfire of the incumbents, started emerging in the middle of the year when you had the French elections, for example, where Macron was kind of battered by them. You had the UK elections where the Conservatives, after 14 years in power, lost office. But then it really took hold in the autumn with the U.S. election coming around, and people used it to predict the outcome of the election. And then when it went against the incumbent or the incumbent successor, people said, aha, this is what this year is really about. But we need to be cautious here. Certainly 2024 was hard on a number of incumbents, like the ones I've just mentioned. But I'm cautious about sweeping explanations that put everybody into the same basket. It's true, for example, very broadly, that over the last 20 years, incumbents have been struggling in a lot of places, and that's for some pretty deep reasons. Don't forget that the global financial crisis of 2008-9 really was like a hammer blow to the legitimacy of democratic governments in many places. And it had a very long tail of damage to incumbents and to the credibility of elites everywhere. In addition, then you had governance during the pandemic, in which citizens felt like, I'm not getting what I want. What is it with these elites? Can't they run societies in a way that's coherent? Yeah. And so there isn't something brand new happening in 2024. And there's a tendency to sort of put a bit too much emphasis in the idea this is all just happening now. Yeah. Whereas, in fact, there's an interesting study that shows, for example, in the 6 years before 2024 in Latin America, lots of elections. Only in one of those did the incumbent manage to hold on, in Paraguay in 2023. Wow. So to the extent incumbents have been under stress, central lesson here is that's true, but for a long time, and there isn't something particular going on now. And secondly, actually, incumbents survived in a number of places, and it's important to remember that. They survived in Ireland, they survived in Finland, they survived in Moldova, they survived in Mongolia, they survived in Taiwan, and in a number of other places. So it wasn't really that all incumbents went out. We were looking a bit close to home and saying the cases we care most about right here seems to be the pattern, and we're a bit over-interpreting that globally.
I'm glad you make that case about we usually start at home. We start with the US, we start with European governments maybe, and then we apply that broadly. We want to try to keep a fairly global perspective, at least for the first half of this podcast, and then maybe zoom in on the US later on. But let's move on to this other major narrative, this idea of a sweeping success for parties on the right throughout democracies around the world. Again, elections in the US, France, other European nations seem to support this, but how true has this trend been globally? Did 2024 signal sort of a broad rightward turn in national politics?
Again, let's be careful about too sweeping of an explanation. Yeah. Certainly the right made some important gains, particularly in Europe and, of course, here in the United States. But a couple of cautionary notes. First, in some cases, it was what we would consider conventional center-right parties. In some cases, it was more parties further to the right. In some countries, like, say, Belgium and Portugal, both did relatively well, and so it wasn't one or the other. In others, like Austria, it was more the far right. And say in Finland, the elections were, good for the sort of conventional center-right. So let's not get carried away with the narrative of sort of far-right populism as taking over the world. Secondly, in a number of elections, if we look a bit further than just to Europe, out there in the world, Sri Lanka, very left-wing outcome in the election. Uruguay moved to the center-left. Botswana, first alternation of power, brought a center-left party into power. Taiwan, the center-left, did well. And so, again, if we open our eyes up, look further out on the horizon, we see a more mixed picture. In addition, we have to be careful about the narrative of the rise of the right applying to political actors and political systems that don't really fall clearly on a right-left spectrum. India, for example, you could try to characterize Modi as a, quote, right-wing leader, but I think a lot of Indians would take objection to that and say, you Westerners have your left-right spectrum that's based on your own histories. India is a bit different. Please don't apply that here. Or Indonesia, for example. How do we determine what's left and what's right in Indonesia with some of the major actors there? So again, we have to be careful about projecting out a narrative that's really based on some cases in Europe, the United States, and saying, aha, another global trend.
Yeah, it's probably worth for all of us to become much more careful when we describe populist, nationalist, right-wing, illiberal governments, to not mix them all up together, especially.
Definitely. And then you have, cases like Mexico where you have certainly populist nationalists in some ways with AMLO and his successor, but not from the right. So again, populism isn't necessarily the preserve only of the right.
Yeah. Okay. Important distinction. And then the third question theory that I mentioned in my introduction, this idea that we can tell something about the broader health of democracy around the globe from what has happened in 2024. Two opposing views here. You'll hear people argue that 2024 was a turning point, a defeat of democracy. Certainly for many here in the US, the re-election of Donald Trump seemed to signal the country moving backwards somehow. And then others point to examples of popular pushback against authoritarian politicians, demonstrations of democratic strength and courage. My mind goes to Georgia here, but there are other examples too. Can you walk us through the ambiguities of this prediction, the nuances of democracy's global health?
Ever since democracy began to really come into question in the world, and the quote, the health of democracy came into question, it's been a bit like a patient staggering around where we're, is it about to fall over in this direction or that direction? What's happening? And we look to the year of elections as this is it. This is really going to determine mega year of elections. We're going to be able to finally come to terms. Is this patient dying, or is it about to get up off the hospital bed and walk out of the hospital? I'm afraid that I don't think this year is really decisive. In the first place, a lot of elections that are held are not that decisive for democracy in either good or bad cases. By good cases, I mean where democracy is fairly stable, like Finland, very stable actually. They have an election, and it tells you a bit about the fortunes of the parties in power or the parties in opposition. It doesn't tell you very much about the fortunes of Finnish democracy more generally. Or in negative cases like Russia, where elections are held, but they're a charade. Elections there this year didn't tell us very much about the fate of Russian politics. It was just, unfortunately, autocratic business as usual. So either democratic business as usual, autocratic business as usual, not much indication. Now, there were some cases that were a bit more telling. On the positive side, Senegal's a very nice example of a country that was in trouble last year. Macky Sall, the president, was taking some actions that really threw into question Senegal's fairly long-standing democratic transition, fear of delaying or even canceling elections. Instead, the elections were held thanks to intervention by the Constitutional Court. Elections were held. A pro-democratic reformist figure came in, and since then has been trying hard to put Senegalese democracy back on track. Or Botswana, for example, a country quite democratic, in a sense a democratic star in Africa, but had always been under the rule in its modern history by one party, a dominant power system. And this election, for the first time, brought alternation of power to Botswana, which is a really important sign of democratic progress for a country that shows some dangers of getting trapped in single-party rule over time. So there is some good news out there. On the bad news front, some people in the United States think the election of Donald Trump is very bad news for democracy. It's a source of tremendous division and argument in the United States.
And probably we would have had that argument had the other side won.
Exactly, yeah. There are certainly
Republicans
many
might
of
have
his
argued.
supporters are very concerned about what the Democrats mean for democracy, but some, I would say credible voices here are concerned about that. So it's a mixed picture, but overall, just not decisive. I'm afraid that the democratic trend in the world, in recent years, the democratic recession has somewhat slowed. I don't think it has not kept at the pace that it had unfortunately moved at in the 2010s and in the early 2020s, that the democratic recession has slowed. It's even close to pausing. But I don't think we can say we're coming out of it and there's a strong forward motion. We're in an uneasy period. And to me, this year reflected this uneasy period. Just if I could just mention quickly one example of ambiguity, the elections in Georgia, very disappointing outcome in the sense that Georgia Dream, a not very democratic party, was elected. But there are credible reports that this election was stolen. Tremendous protests on the streets of Tbilisi and other parts of Georgia. Is this bad news or good news for democracy? It's certainly bad news that Georgia Dream won and probably stole the election. It's good news that Georgians are standing up and fighting hard for democracy. So you have cases like that you can take, certainly depressing outcome in a certain way, but heartening outcome in another.
Yeah. So I'm hearing a lot of nuance, a lot of room for ambiguity in your answers. And
by the way, you don't get rich and famous giving out nuance. But I've been doing it for many years, and I'm determined to stick to it because there's just a hunger out there to reach relatively simple conclusions about the state of democracy in the world. And we have to recognize not that complexity is everything, but it's going to sharpen our analysis if we look into these kind of cases instead just latching on to sort of simple explanations.
Right. I am still a podcast host, though, so I'm going to try to. I'm not going to ask you for your sweeping theory of what 2024 means for democracy, but I might ask you, did you go into this year with a hypothesis? And what surprised you, perhaps, of what we've seen in 2024?
Well, if I had a hypothesis, what might it have been? I guess my hypothesis would be that citizens are very engaged in many places. Citizens are stirred up for a lot of reasons. They're not getting the governance they want. The information environment has become very intense and, highly transnational. And so people are following elections in a lot of places where they're not. Not just the U.S. election, where people were following to a remarkable degree around the world, but other elections like the UK elections are followed. The French elections have attracted attention. The South African elections attracted a lot of attention, and so forth. And so I was expecting a year of intensity, both in terms of citizen engagement and in terms of a broader international engagement and keeping an eye on what's happening. I think both those things have happened. There have been a lot of protests around elections as citizens have been unhappy with the results they have, whether it's like they don't like the outcome, like in Austria, they don't like a far-right party gaining, and so they protest, or they feel the election was just blindly stolen, like in Venezuela, and so they protest. So there's been a lot of citizen unrest around the elections. And there's been intense attention. We're still following the Georgian protests fairly closely, I would say. Venezuela is not off the map. People are still talking about South Africa now in a coalition. What does that mean? And so forth. So if there was a hypothesis, it was the intensity of engagement. I think that has held true.
And do you think, can we say something about whether citizen engagement is good for democracy? We hear often that, apathy is what really undermines democracy. Do you think that engagement overall is a positive trend?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I do think so. Obviously, if it's, engagement in terms of cult-like enthusiasm for an anti-democratic figure, which you might get in a few places, that's bad. But on the whole, of course you want citizens deeply engaged. You want them in there caring. You want them in there fighting peacefully, fighting in a political sense of engaging and contesting. And, democracy doesn't just die in darkness. Democracy dies in apathy. And so the engagement is good overall. And you see authoritarians, the biggest dilemma for authoritarians holding an election is trying to get the turnout up to the needed level because citizens are so apathetic. Sure. They know the pointless of an election in Rwanda where the leader got more than 99% of the vote, in Russia where obviously it's a meaningless election. Yeah. You see those leaders, particularly in Russia, for example, trying to stir up getting citizens out to vote or lying about the voter turnout. So apathy is, often on the part of the autocrats.
Okay. We're going to take a short break now, and then we'll talk about the causes of democratic backsliding, how to address them, and what the effects of the US elections might be for democracy globally. That's coming up next after this short break. Thanks for listening to The World Unpacked from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. If you enjoy the show, make sure to check out other audio series and podcasts from Carnegie. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show. We're back with Tom Carothers. Tom, I really wanted to dig a bit deeper into the causes of democratic backsliding. In a recent article in the Journal of Democracy that you co-authored with Brendan Hartnett, you challenged what you describe as a sort of unhelpful conventional wisdom about backsliding, that it is caused by a failure of democracies to deliver the resources that people need. Can you talk more about why this is a common misunderstanding and how we should better understand the phenomenon of democratic backsliding?
When democratic backsliding started to become a dominant trend, which it did sometime in the late 2000s and then across the 2010s, it was really the driving force, I would say, in global politics. People began, of course, searching for explanations. Why is this happening? And one of the explanations that people gravitated towards fairly quickly was this idea that, it's a failure of democracy to deliver. And the thinking was the following, that if democracy fails to deliver, the citizens become alienated from it. Think, democracy is good for nothing. And they vote for anti-democratic figures who threaten to tear apart democracy to provide a better life for people. It's an attractive idea. It has a certain sort of common sense plausibility to it. And I've noticed in workshops that I was in and public meetings and other things, you would say this. People say, why is this happening to democracy? And people say, because it's failing to deliver. And everyone would nod their heads. That's it. Now, I don't like simple conventional wisdoms. And I'd think about it, and I'd think, maybe in Tunisia, for example, the self-coup by the president there several years ago, he was able to ride the wave of Tunisians' unhappiness about how democracy had not produced a better life for most Tunisians and have an initial wave of popularity. So I can see a case there.
Where democracy was really on the ballot also in an earlier election.
Yes, it had been. Yeah. But then I would look at other cases. I'd look at Poland and I think, wait a minute. Poland entered, into a serious anti-democratic wave in the late 2010s. But Poland had been the best economy in Central Europe. So wait a minute. Poland was delivering as a democracy more for its citizens than any of its Central European peers, yet it was the one, together with Hungary, that was going backward the most. So that doesn't confirm our hypothesis there. Or I would look at Israel. And Israel began having serious trouble with, divisive polarization between the right and the non-right in Israel, and an anti-democratic trend coming from the right. It wasn't about a failure of Israeli democracy to deliver the economic goods to Israelis. The Israeli economy was a kind of a miracle economy of the last 20 years in many ways for many Israeli citizens, at least. And so it wasn't Israel's failure to deliver as a democracy that was leading to a right-wing, somewhat illiberal movement and what Netanyahu was doing to the judicial system and other things. Bangladesh was a developmental success story, a superstar at the World Bank. And its growth rate over many years, the same years where it went backward democratically. Turkey, another developmental star, an incredibly quickly growing economy in the 2000s, yet the very years where democracy was going backward. So I began thinking, wait a minute, this just doesn't seem as simple as it might appear. So I did this study together with a colleague, Brendan, and we looked at, rates of inequality, rates of economic growth, and other socioeconomic indicators, and just did not find a correlation or any sort of causal pattern. And that seemed to be other things going on. So what other things, you would naturally ask? And I came to the conclusion that really what's happening in the world is that many democracy came to many countries that have fairly weak traditions of democracy, relatively weak institutions. And in those systems, as competition for power has gone on, anti-democratic actors have emerged, fairly strong-minded players who think, I'd like a piece of this power. And then they run for office, often on a democratic ticket as reformers. Modi, ran for office as a reformer, saying, I'm going to fix Indian democracy. And they don't run on an anti-democratic ticket saying, I'm anti-democratic. They say, no, I'm going to strengthen, I'm going to get this back into shape. And voters say, yeah, it's time to send the system a signal. We're going to make this country great again. Sounds familiar. And so people are running on saying, I'm going to fix democracy. And what's happening is they get elected, and then in order to carry out their program, they start pushing against the barriers that on their power. And so they don't like the judicial system because it tells them they can't do this or that. And so they start to undermine the judiciary. They don't like the press because it's criticizing them. So they start to come down hard on the press. They don't like these pesky civil society groups that are inspecting their corruption and, using transparency as a tool to, show their wrongdoing. So they crack down on them. And so it's the expansion of power by elected leaders who are just determined to keep amassing power for power's sake. And it isn't that, they're all about this issue of delivering. It's about the difficulty of constraining power holders. That's democracy's central challenge, is how do you constrain power? And when it's, very settled in a country, like to go back to Finland, where the rule of law is very meaningful, then, you can constrain power through law and through other institutions. But in a lot of countries, power holders come in and say, those judges weren't elected. I was. I'm going to do what I want. And we have an epidemic in the world of elected leaders who are simply very hard to contain and are very determined to keep amassing power. They're feeding off each other in many cases, picking up narratives from each other of fake news or other things like that. And so what's really happening is a demonstration of the weakness of constraints more than the failure of democracy to deliver socioeconomically.
This is fascinating. Thank you for explaining that. And I would recommend the article to everyone listening. Since we are talking about conventional pieces of wisdom, I wanted to run another one by you. This idea that the best way to undermine, weaken undemocratic forces is to put them in power, put them in charge, and then have people see for themselves that they don't deliver. And then they won't be voted in the next time around, should there be another election. What's your take on this?
That's a dangerous prescription unless you know that your institutions of countervailing power, your judiciary is really well rooted, your press is very strong, and these different countervailing institutions are going to be able to stand up against a leader who's very anti-democratic. If you really know a party or a leader is very anti-democratic, thinking, this will fix them, we'll just put them into power, very dangerous, given the record of recent years. Think of Erdogan, for example, if you thought, I know the way we'll get rid of this guy, he talks a big game, we'll just let him get into power. Well, once into power, look what he's done. Very determined guy who has undercut, any attempts to constrain him, or most attempts to constrain him. So I'm not a big fan of that prognosis. It is true that if you have a relatively well-settled democracy where the institutions are fairly strong, and you have a new party which is kind of promising the world, and you sort of say, okay, well, let them try being the mayor of the biggest city, or let them try, a time in power. Maybe that would be okay. But the lessons of the last 10 or 15 years have been the surprising power of elected leaders who are determined to amass power, and how hard it is to stop them.
Yeah. Okay, so we have sort of looked at elections around the world so far, but I did want to zoom in on the US for this last part of our conversation. And maybe I'll just start us off with a very broad question. How much effect do you think Donald Trump's re-election will have on democracy globally in the coming years?
Sophia, I think overall that in most countries, the direction of politics is determined by local actors and local dynamics. So I don't think the United States will have a determinative effect on the trajectory of democracy, and whether the new government in Sri Lanka really works out well or not, whether the Zambian government is able to continue the reforms they've attempted and so forth. So in many cases, no. But it is a globalized world. The United States election is watched very closely by people around the world. The United States does have an outsized influence. And so what are a couple of the red flags, or at least yellow flags, that are flapping now in the current winds of U.S. politics? The arrival to power of Donald Trump in January will bring, I'd say, two dangers with it for global democracy. The first is that many of his political methods or political messaging are read in the world in very negative ways for democracy. When he rails about the fake news, for example, during his first term as president, he railed about fake news a lot, but he didn't really take many concrete actions to hurt the free press in the United States. But the problem is, what's more bark than bite in the United States? When you take that idea and take it to Belarus or take it to Sri Lanka or take it to wherever it might be, Brazil, and they say, oh, apparently this is what democracies do, or democratic leaders do, is they rail against independent press and they use the tools they have to constrain it. The bark becomes worse abroad. And so what happens is messages here that are maybe not as disturbing as they might be if you look carefully at what Donald Trump might be able to do if he acted on some of his statements, whether about the free press, whether about political retribution and so forth. In other countries, those can play out in much more serious ways.
Right.
Second danger, or a second yellow flag that's flapping, is unfortunately soon-to-be President Trump does have a predilection for some leaders in the world. He tends to favor certain leaders in the world who are not very democratic. Obviously, he mentioned Viktor Orban of Hungary in the presidential debate and said, when you look around the world, who likes me? Well, look at this leader. And he's a strong guy, as he said. And clearly, Viktor Orban's going to get a boost at home politically and say, hey, I've got the most powerful person in the world behind me. So, I might want to crack down a little harder on this person or this organization, and I know I'm going to get protection. Whether or not he really will, he may well believe that. And so leaders who see friendship with Donald Trump as emboldening them, protecting them, and who have an anti-democratic inclination or temperament or record, as some of these leaders do, we could see an escalation of anti-democratic actions, at least in a certain number of countries. Neither of these things will be sweeping global trends, but both of them, the messaging from the United States and the embrace of certain leaders, are troubling.
Okay, let me ask you something to build on that, and maybe it won't lead us anywhere, but maybe it will. So I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you think these undemocratic movements, parties, can link up to actually pursue a transformative global agenda? We hear a lot about, the links between the Orban regime and the MAGA crowd, for example, the intellectual, ideological exchanges on pro-nativist policies, on how to maybe centralize power, undermine the deep state. Those exchanges are focused mostly on domestic issues, and nationalist, populist parties are, by necessity, often focused inward. But how likely do you think it is that we might see them band together in a real alliance to pursue the proactive dismantling of multilateral institutions like the EU or the UN, for example? I guess another way of asking that is, how important is it that America believes in these institutions if we want to uphold them?
There's been a lot of talk on a parallel issue, which is, an autocratic alliance or axis going on in the world, Iran, North Korea, Russia, China. And people have taken apart that idea a bit and said, sure, they're working together, in their view, pragmatically on certain things for certain reasons, but they're not really a deep felt alliance in that sense. And we have to be careful about overreading a certain set of actions as reflecting a genuine alliance. I think it's similar with respect to these kinds of elected illiberal leaders. There are certain themes, particularly the anti-progressive themes about LGBTQ rights, about immigration, about gender, that come through, and people say, well, they're doing this over here. Immigration's a bad thing. Look at the United States and what it's saying about immigration, so we need to follow the same path. Those aren't always anti-democratic. They're sometimes illiberal in the sense of wanting to reduce the sphere of liberalism that's offered, in a sense, to the citizenry. But I don't really think whether or not, Modi figures out how to take apart Indian democracy, that he really needs, that much of a playbook from the United States. In some ways, he may get the wind at his back a bit if he feels that, well, Donald Trump, says he loves me and I can do these things without criticism. But that's not really the same as an alliance that's feeding, anti-democratic actions everywhere. It's more opportunistic by these leaders picking up certain messages and saying, well, this is apparently what you do. But I think we need to be careful about thinking there's a new kind of anti-democratic cabal forming within the democratic world that's really going to undercut democracy. Now, that's a different question from whether or not the rise of far-right parties in Europe are able to, penetrate the European institutions, get a greater grip on the European Parliament, undercut cohesiveness in the European Union. That's
capitalize on a potential partnership with Donald Trump to do that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's a specific domain there where, trouble is at hand. But to say that there's a global, sort of movement here, alliance, I think we need to be careful about not overreading into the current moment.
Got it. Okay. As we are about to end this conversation, we're nearing the end. What lessons do you think that policymakers, especially in democracies, should take from this year of elections, if any? And are there any specific areas that they should focus on to adapt to the shifting democratic landscape that we've described here?
I think in all democracies, it's the lesson of this year, but in a sense of recent years, the whole democratic backsliding trend that we've talked about, Sophia. I think the lesson has to be we have to prize, we have to reinforce, we have to do everything we can to strengthen the institutions that constrain power in a pro-democratic way. We have to stand up for judiciaries when they're undercut. We have to stand up for independent media. We have to stand up for electoral commissions. We have to stand up for civil society when it's threatened. We have to stand up for political opposition figures who are being harassed or put in jail and so forth. If we don't defend the bulwarks of democracy with everything we have, then leaders who are determined to override them are going to win. And so it's a lesson of take what we know to be the core of a functioning democracy, these institutions, value them highly, and in the heat of the moment, whatever agenda one is pursuing, don't lose sight of these institutional safeguards. Don't lose sight of these underlying democratic norms and values. Because if we do, then everything is like the apps on your phone when you push the wrong button and they're all jiggling and you're afraid to touch it. That's the way democracy feels a bit that way in the world right now. So reinforce. Don't start moving the pieces around too quickly.
This has been such a rich and important conversation. Thank you very much, Tom. Before we end, at this point of the show, I like to ask our guests what book, what paper they would recommend to our listeners to better understand the issue we've been talking about. Feel free to recommend your own papers I have throughout this conversation, or if there's anything else that's on your mind.
Goodness, you caught me by surprise with that one. In recommending one's own article seems a bit limited and a bit vain. There's been a flood of books on democracy in recent years, some of which are, really excellent. I think, the follow-up by Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt to their first book, How Democracies Die, their second book, which is sort of follows through on the argument that came out this year, was a very valuable contribution.
Excellent. I'll make sure to read that over the break. It was a pleasure to have you on the World Unpacked, Tom. Thank you, and we look forward to having you back again.
My pleasure.
Thanks. You have been listening to The World Unpacked, an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at thecarnegieendowment.org. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, Mira Varghese produces the show, and Clarissa Guerrero is our executive producer. I'm Sophia Besch. Thanks for listening.